And I, again, want to thank Nick and Jim for the opportunity. This is my third Information Governance Conference. Attended the first two in Hartford. First opportunity to present here, so very excited. Very poor choice of font color there, which is fine. Kind of the short story is I've been doing this for a long time. I was a finance major who got into web development, who got into IT security, got my first Microsoft certification in like 1998, did some Y2K remediation. But for the better part of 10 years or so, I've been focused on email management. So customers that have legacy on-premise archives that they're consolidating into one, migrating from on-premise to the cloud, a lot of activity with Office 365, which we'll talk about. So that's kind of my background and how I kind of approach things. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was, centralizing and consolidating and migrating to the cloud, right? So I try to come at this from kind of a storyteller perspective. I'm currently with BDO Consulting, and I wasn't aware until I joined. They're the 5th largest accounting firm in the world. I've seen more BDO commercials since I joined 6 weeks ago than I had ever seen, before that. But a few jobs ago, I was on the IT side within financial services, and one of the things I had to do was migrate the organization from Lotus Notes to Microsoft Exchange. And this is around like the 2011, 2012 timeframe. And Gartner had helped us identify what the solutions were. And at the end of the day, we chose Exchange and Outlook, but they weren't quite ready to go to the cloud yet. Just the technology wasn't quite there. Financial services wasn't quite ready to go. So you kind of fast forward to today, and again, looking at some stats, and I found these interesting in that, the research indicated that 13% of publicly traded companies are, using email in the cloud, 8.5% with Office 365, the remainder with Google for Business. And I would say that this number is low because what I see in the marketplace, the clients I talk to, there's a lot of activity migrating to Office 365, right? Microsoft is providing some very compelling offers from a licensing perspective, customers that have enterprise licenses for on-premise solutions and looking to get them from on-premise to the cloud, right? So again, a lot of activity in the space, and you kind of say, well, how does this relate to storage and retention, right? So I've got a client that just went through this very recently, and they kind of put the cart before the horse to some extent where they just kind of said, hey, I've got to migrate by this date, get me there, don't care how you get me there, and we'll kind of pick up the pieces later. So they did that. And what they realized is they had a legacy email infrastructure, and they had a very small amount of server storage for their emails. The rest was in these PST files that were local on the desktop. They get to Office 365, and they've got 25 gigs worth of storage. This is like, life is good. IT is happy. They're like, we don't have to worry about people going over quota or migrating their data to PSTs. We're just going to save it all on the server. And then the consultants came in with legal and compliance, and they're like, are you really sure that that's the right answer? Do you want to save 25 gigs worth of personal email data, even though you have the opportunity to do so? Is that really the right move, right? So a lot of clients are kind of struggling with this, really to figure out what the right answer is, right? So I think this, the graphic's been used before, and Nick mentioned, there's a lot of information that they've put out, from an information governance perspective, the Information Coalition. So I just kind of borrowed this, this graphic, where does IG fit in, right? So I kind of come at things from an IT background. I've done enough, business requirements and documentation and policy development to kind of, talk that game as well. But from an IG perspective, there's a lot of different answers to the question, right? So it really depends what you're trying to do, how you're trying to do it. Again, from a storage and retention perspective, I think what I've seen is there's a lot of complexity, right? So you've got people that are looking at things, from a legal perspective, from a compliance perspective, and I think we've heard, some of the messages in some of the other sessions around, over retention, and looking at kind of where your quick wins are, where your opportunities are, and to try it again, not to boil the ocean, all at once, but to look at it, pragmatically and try to see, where does IG fit in? Where is your seat at the table? Who's at that table? I know there's a session later today around kind of building your information governance committee, and there's a lot of activity in that space as well. So this is actually a BDO slide that I kind of borrowed, don't tell anybody. But from a common challenges perspective, it resonated with me because these are a lot of the things I see at my clients every day, right? So from a requirements perspective, what are the business requirements? How recent are they? Who wrote them? When did they get written? Functional, technical, legal, and regulatory. And you really need to have that complete picture to do something successfully, whether it's defensible deletion or migrating to a new solution, looking at different storage options, et cetera. So you've got your requirements that you really need to understand, document, and articulate to everybody, right? So from a geography perspective, having the opportunity to work with global clients at large organizations, a lot of these projects get run out of the United States, and it's not always the right answer just to have that US-centric approach. So to the extent that you can, if you're in a global organization, bring in people from the UK, from other parts of the world, to get their buy-in, to get their understanding, so that the project is successful. Again, from a industry-specific perspective, I spent a lot of time in financial services, heavily regulated industries, pharmaceutical, insurance, public sector, et cetera. You want to just understand what the requirements are from a regulatory perspective. Make sure you're not over-retaining, under-retaining. Take your legal hold in consideration. And then also there's a big part of this just around the different organizations. I mean, every organization is different, right? They're all unique. And the culture within the organization, I think, is really important, because I've got some clients that are very go, 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 and they want to change things, and they've got new people coming in and trying to make their name for themselves. And you've got other organizations that people have been in place for a long time. They're maybe hesitant to change. They don't see the value in those changes. So you've got to take, and there's probably other things that we could talk about here also, but taking all these things into account from a storage and retention perspective. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was when does more equal less, and potentially when does less equal more? Again, looking at it from a storage perspective. Having been to this conference, for the third year, and going to some other conferences as well, and even listening to Cheryl this morning, there's kind of that debate over, big data, keeping everything, getting rid of everything, and it's certainly a challenging discussion, right? So some stats here, and I don't think this is going to surprise anybody. Obviously, the stuff that we save and the things that we're saving, it's different than it was a few years ago. It's growing. Whether that number, how accurate that number is subject to debate, but 42% growth over the next few years. And the Internet of Things has been a hot topic. Just talking about where all this data is, connected cars, the Nest thermostat in your house, the Fitbit on your wrist, and maybe the data types don't necessarily apply to your organization, but if they do, I mean, we've got manufacturing clients that are looking at the connected car data. I've got some public sector clients that are looking at, say, wearable devices for security and for police officers. There's just a lot of data that wasn't out there a few years ago that's there now. You've got to think about it, right? So even within your organization, no matter what vertical industry you're in, there might be data that you could use to your advantage. It might come back to haunt you, but you need to think about where that data is, what it is. So a lot of the activity I'm seeing right now is around data mapping. So we've got clients that are trying to understand what they've got, right? So what systems, who has access to them, where is the data? So they're investing in consulting resources and in tools and technologies to try to figure this out, because it's not a simple solution. So there's definitely a lot of activity in this space just to reflect the big data kind of challenges, right? So I think this is the slide I was going to really spend the most time on. What are the conversations that I'm having in talking to clients? What's being discussed? Again, I kind of talked about the example of the implications of additional space from an Office 365 perspective. Kind of to migrate or not to migrate, so that's another good question. So if you've got a legacy system that's been in place for 6 or 8 or 10 years, do you even need that data? Do you need to migrate it to your new solution? Can you let it die on the vine? What are the implications of decommissioning that legacy system versus migrating the data over to the new system? Is it going to be in a format that you can actually use the data when you migrate it from A to B, right? The retention and legal hold considerations, I think are pretty straightforward. But again, do you have systems that can even put something on hold, right? So I had a client that, again, from an email point of view, had a large litigation. They had all sorts of legacy archives, but because it was an on-premise archive that was a few years old, to actually put the number of people on hold that they needed to accommodate, it would have required a massive investment from an infrastructure perspective to pull that off. So what they decided to do was just not delete anything, right? And at the end of the day, by the time they figured out that in the 30,000 person organization, that it only ended up being a few thousand people on legal hold, it took them 18 months, 2 years to kind of figure that out. And to kind of recover from that, they're still recovering from it, right? So just understanding what the technical capabilities are of these systems and how they work, and partnering with your IT folks, partnering with legal and compliance. I've heard a lot of people that I've met even at this conference, and they said that their job is really being that middleman, right? Being the person that kind of can talk IT, can talk to legal, can talk to compliance. I think Ann's a great example of that, sitting in the back of the room. Understanding where your data resides, who has access to it. Again, this kind of goes back to that whole data map question. So if you do get a litigation or you do get a cybersecurity breach, do you have it documented? Who has access to what, right? So there's a lot of conversation around that. The different types of data, again, for these legacy systems, you might